The winter of 1880 and 1881 killed things that were supposed to be permanent. It killed cattle that had survived 3 previous winters, animals that knew how to find shelter, animals that knew how to read the sky, animals that knew how to stay alive when the wind came down off the open prairie with the sound of a freight train and the patience of a thing that had nowhere else to be. It killed trees that had stood for decades. Their trunks split in the night with sounds like rifle shots as the ice expanded inside them. It killed the certainty of experienced men, men who had built solid houses with good lumber and proper windows, men who had prepared carefully and still found themselves counting their remaining firewood at 2 o'clock in the morning, with their wives shivering under every blanket they owned, and their children's lips going the color of old plums in the failing light of a fire that would not last until dawn. But on a low hill at the northern edge of Millhaven, Nebraska, something was not dying. Through the white fury of that storm, a thin thread of smoke rose straight up from what appeared to be nothing more than a grass-covered mound of earth. Not from a chimney, not from a house, from the ground itself, steady, unhurried, as if the blizzard howling across the plains at 42 degrees below zero was someone else's problem entirely. The men in the valley would later say they had never seen anything like it. They would say it the way men say things they cannot explain and do not want to admit they could not have predicted. They would say it the way men say things when they are still trying to decide whether the story makes them look smaller or larger in the telling. This is the story of how she got there. Her name was Agnes Whitfield. She was 63 years old, and 6 months before that storm, she walked into Millhaven carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag that had once held flour. The morning was late June of 1880. The sky was the color of a clean blue cup, and the prairie smelled of sun-warmed grass and the slow exhalation of earth that had spent 6 months under snow and was now spending its summer remembering what warmth meant. Agnes had walked most of the way from a farm 70 miles to the east, a farm she had built with her own hands over 30 years of marriage, a farm where she had buried 2 stillborn children in the south field, beneath a cottonwood she had planted herself. A farm where her husband Reuben had died of a heart that gave out one cold morning in February while he was carrying water to the horses, and Agnes had found him 3 hours later, frozen to the ground where he had fallen. Reuben had a son from his first marriage, a son named Cyrus who lived in Chicago, who had not visited his father in 12 years, who had not come to the funeral, and who had arrived 3 weeks after the funeral with a lawyer and a piece of paper that said the farm had never legally belonged to Agnes at all. The paper was old. The paper was clever. The paper had been drafted before Agnes had ever met Reuben in the months after his first wife had died, when he had wanted to make sure his only son would inherit. And in 30 years of marriage, Reuben had never gotten around to updating it, never gotten around to mentioning it, never gotten around to telling Agnes that the soil under her feet did not belong to her in any way the law would recognize. Cyrus had given her 30 days. He had given her 30 days the way a man gives a stranger 30 days when he is trying to look reasonable about a thing that is not reasonable. He had told her she could keep her clothes and her grandmother's Bible and one small trunk of household items. He had told her there was a respectable home for elderly women in Lincoln that took in widows in her situation. He had said the word situation with the particular delicacy of a man who has decided that another person's life is a problem he is now solving. Agnes had not argued. She had not cried in front of him. She had not begged. She had simply nodded once and gone upstairs to the bedroom she had shared with Reuben for 30 years and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her own hands. Her hands were 63 years old. They were brown across the backs from 3 decades of prairie sun. The knuckles were swollen in the particular way of knuckles that have done 40 years of hard work and are now reminding their owner of every individual instance of that work. There was a scar across the base of her left thumb from a butchering knife in the winter of 1862. There was a paler scar on the inside of her right wrist from a kettle that had tipped when she was reaching for a child who had cried out. A child who was now buried beneath the cottonwood in the south field. Her hands knew things. That was what she thought about sitting on the edge of that bed. Her hands knew how to make soap from rendered fat and lye. They knew how to set a snare. They knew how to deliver a calf that was turned wrong inside its mother. They knew how to read the surface of a creek bed for the tracks of animals that had passed in the night. They knew how to seal a wall with clay and prairie grass in the old Cherokee way her grandmother had taught her when she was 9 years old, sitting by a fire in the Tennessee hill country. Her hands knew enough to start over. That was the conclusion she came to, sitting on the edge of that bed. It was not a happy conclusion. It was not a brave one. It was simply the conclusion that her hands made available to her the way a road makes itself available to a person who has been told they cannot stay where they are. She had $18 sewn into the lining of her coat. It was money she had set aside in small amounts over 30 years of marriage from the sale of eggs and butter and the careful margins of a household budget that she had managed without ever once telling her husband she was setting anything aside. She had not been hiding it from Reuben. She had been hiding it from time, from the future, from the possibility that one day she would need it without knowing why or for what. That was the day she found out why. She left the farm on foot at first light the next morning. She walked west. She walked west because there was nothing east of her that wanted her, and there was nothing south of her. She knew well enough to count on, and there was nothing north of her, but more of the same kind of grief. So she walked west, into the part of Nebraska where the Homestead Act still made land available to anyone, with the persistence to claim it. And she walked for 9 days, and on the morning of the 10th day she arrived in Millhaven. Millhaven was 40 households scattered across a shallow valley in eastern Nebraska. It was the kind of settlement that existed because the federal government had told people that land was free if they were willing to fight for it. The people who had come here had fought. They had survived grasshopper plagues and summer droughts and 3 previous winters. And in the pride of that survival, something had settled into them like hardwood settling into the shape of long use. Something that did not bend easily. They did not trust outsiders. They did not trust elderly women arriving alone with worn-down boots and a flour sack bag, and no story they were willing to tell at all. The first building Agnes entered was Constance Webb's General Store. It was the largest wooden structure on the main road. It was where people bought flour and salt and nails and lamp oil. It was also where they exchanged information about their neighbors, which in a settlement of 40 households was a more valuable currency than any of those other things. Constance Webb was 38 years old. She had been running the store alone since her husband had died of summer fever the previous year. She was not a warm woman in the way that word is usually meant. She did not offer comfort easily. She did not smile without reason. But she had a quality that was rarer than warmth in a place like Millhaven. She paid attention. When Agnes Whitfield walked through the door of that store on the morning of June 22nd, 1880, Constance was the only person in the room who did not immediately look away. There were 6 men in the store. 2 of them examined their bootlaces with sudden, intense interest. 2 others turned to face the shelves as though they had just remembered something they needed. The 5th man, a wiry rancher named Eddings, made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a word. The 6th man did not look away. He stepped forward. His name was Aldous Holt. He was 55 years old. He was the most prosperous man within 50 miles of Millhaven. He owned cattle and good farmland and a 2-story house with real glass windows and a porch where he sometimes stood in the evenings with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders surveying the valley below, with the expression of a man who had decided that what he could see from where he was standing was sufficient proof that the world was arranged correctly. He had a thick gray mustache. He had a voice that had learned over decades to sound like reason, even when it was delivering judgment. Behind him stood his son. Thomas Holt was 22 years old. He had his father's height and his father's broad shoulders and his father's habit of standing with his weight slightly forward, as though every conversation might at any moment require him to step into it. But he did not yet have his father's certainty. You could see it in the way his eyes moved. He was still watching. He was still figuring out which parts of his father he wanted to keep, and which parts he was going to have to find a way to leave behind, without quite admitting that he was leaving them behind. Aldous Holt looked at Agnes for a long moment before speaking. "Ma'am," he said in the tone a man uses when he has already decided the answer and is only performing the question as a courtesy. "This isn't territory suited to a woman traveling alone, particularly not a woman of your years. The decent thing would be to return to your family, or if your circumstances don't permit that, to seek a proper situation in Lincoln, where there are homes that take in widows in your position." Agnes set her canvas bag on the floor. She looked at him. "I don't have family, sir," she said, "and the Homestead Act says any citizen can claim 160 acres. Eddings let out a short laugh from his corner of the store. "Work it," he said. "At your age, the wind out here pulls nails from the walls. Your first winter will take you before the first snowfall." A woman near the flour barrel turned at this. She wore black, the kind of deep, unreflective black that seemed to absorb light rather than block it. Her name was Edna Ward. She was the wife of the local minister. Her gray eyes had the particular quality of arriving at conclusions before they had finished looking. She moved forward with small, precise steps. "There's a Methodist home in Lincoln," she said, her voice sweet in the particular way of sweetness that has another substance underneath it. "They take in widows of good character. You'd have a roof. You'd have meals. You'd have the company of women in similar situations. There's no shame in recognizing the limits of one's circumstances." Something moved in Agnes's chest. Not anger exactly. Something older than anger. Something that had been forming in her during the 9 days of walking from the farm through the heat and the nights sleeping under her coat. It was the thing her grandmother Celeste had tried to put into words once sitting by a fire in Tennessee, 54 years before, and had only partly succeeded because some things resist words. "Thank you for your concern," Agnes said. "I'll be staying." The three of them, Aldous, Eddings, Edna, exchanged a look that communicated without any of them speaking the shared prediction that this foolish old woman would not see October. Agnes had $18 sewn into the lining of her coat. That was the sum total of what 30 years of marriage had left her, with that the lawyer's paper had not taken away. She knew from asking along the road that a small wooden house required at least $80 in lumber alone, not counting windows, not counting hardware, not counting labor. She had 18. The mathematics were not complicated. She went to Constance Webb and asked about land available for homestead claim. Constance looked at her for a long moment before answering. She was, as already noted, a woman who paid attention. And what she was paying attention to right now was a 63-year-old woman with worn-down boots and a flour sack bag who had just refused to be moved by Aldous Holt, which was something Constance had not seen any adult man or woman accomplish in recent memory. "There is a parcel on the north slope," Constance said, Hard ground. No trees. No surface water. Nobody's touched it. That's because nobody wants it, Agnes said. That's correct. How much to register the claim? $16. Agnes counted out the money and pushed it across the counter. That was when Constance did something unexpected. She reached under the counter and produced a small leather-bound notebook. She set it between them with the deliberate care of someone placing something valuable. "I'll sell you supplies on account," she said. "You can pay with money when you have it. But the terms aren't money." Agnes looked at the notebook. "Then what are the terms?" "I don't know yet." Agnes raised her eyes from the notebook to Constance's face. "When I figure out what I want from you," Constance said, "I'll come and tell you. You'll sign for it now or I won't extend the credit." It was either a trap or an opportunity. Agnes could not tell which. But she had $18, and after the land fee, she had $2 left, and she had a winter ahead of her. And she was 63 years old and entirely alone. And sometimes the only honest answer to the question of whether something is a trap or an opportunity is that it is both and you have to go through it anyway. She signed. Aldous Holt had witnessed this transaction from across the store. As Agnes was gathering her purchases and preparing to leave, Aldous moved to stand near Eddings. His voice was low. But Constance's store was not a large building, and Constance Webb was, as has already been established, a woman who paid attention. "She won't make it to October," Aldous said. Eddings did not respond. He stood looking out the window in the direction Agnes had gone. The expression on his face was one that would have been difficult to name, but it was not simple agreement. The parcel Agnes claimed was everything Constance had described and less. The ground on the north slope was dense and pale. It was the kind of soil that looked as though the life had been pressed out of it over centuries. The grass grew low and yellow. There was no shade. There was no shelter from the constant Nebraska wind. There was no visible water. It was land that even desperate men had passed over. Agnes spent her first 2 nights sleeping outside with her bag as a pillow, looking up at the flat black sky with its extravagant scatter of stars, and thinking about her grandmother. Celeste Whitfield had been an Appalachian woman of mixed Cherokee and Scots-Irish descent. She had spent her childhood in the hill country of eastern Tennessee, in the years before the Trail of Tears, in a household where her own mother had taught her things that did not appear in any textbook and had no formal name. Celeste had died when Agnes was 11 years old, but she had spent a great deal of those 11 years teaching the child things that school did not teach, things that did not have textbooks, knowledge that lived in the hands and the eyes, in the particular quality of attention one paid to the earth beneath one's feet. On the 3rd night, sitting at the base of the low hill that marked the edge of her claim, Agnes let herself remember one specific thing. She had been 8 years old. She had been sitting by the fire in their small house in Tennessee. Her grandmother had been there with her weathered hands in her lap, and her voice quiet in the way it got when she was about to say something she considered important. "The ground under your feet is never as cold as the air, Agnes. In summer it holds the cool. In winter it holds the warmth. It doesn't fight the weather. It absorbs it and gives it back. If you build your house in the earth, you're not building a house. You're joining something that was already there." Agnes sat on the north slope of Millhaven, 63 years old, and thought about that for a long time. Then she stood up. She looked at the hill in front of her, and she spent the rest of the night making calculations in the dirt with a stick. In the morning, she walked back to Constance Webb's store and bought a second-hand shovel for $2.50. She began to dig on the south-facing side of the hill where the morning sun would strike the entrance directly, not down the way you dig a well, inward, the way an animal makes a den. The idea was to create a room inside the hill rather than on top of it, to let the earth be the walls rather than fight against them. The work was severe. The ground was dense and uncooperative and full of rocks that had to be pried out and carried away. Her hands blistered before noon of the first day. The blisters broke and reformed as calluses over the following week. Her nails broke down to the quick. The muscles of her back burned each night with a deep, specific pain that barely let her sleep. But the hole grew. On the third day of digging, Aldous Holt rode by on his horse. He stopped. He watched her for a moment. She was covered in dirt to her elbows. Her gray hair was tied back with a strip of cloth she had torn from the hem of a second dress. Her boots were caked. Her dress was caked. There was a smear of pale clay across her cheekbone, where she had wiped sweat with the back of her wrist. "In the name of creation," Aldous said, "what are you doing? Building my home, sir." He looked at the hole in the hillside. He looked back at her. He had the expression of a man who had encountered something that did not fit his existing categories. "That's a cave," he said. "That's a hole in the ground. Civilized people build wooden houses. Lumber for a small house runs $80, sir. I have two. There's a reason a house costs $80. Things cost what they amount to for a reason. You'll live like an animal." Agnes drove her shovel into the earth and looked at him. "Animals survive winter, sir. I heard 3 families lost fingers to frostbite in wooden houses last year." Aldous Holt's face did something complicated. He was not accustomed to being answered by elderly women who had just arrived in his territory with nothing but a flour sack bag and a claim receipt. He spurred his horse and rode away without responding. But Constance Webb, who happened to be making a supply delivery to a nearby farm that afternoon, had seen the exchange from a distance. She noted it in the same private mental ledger, where she recorded everything that seemed worth remembering, which was most things. That evening, Agnes sat at the entrance of her unfinished hole and ate a piece of hard bread and a strip of dried venison she had bought from Constance for 9 cents. The sun was setting in the long, slow way that prairie sunsets do, the light spreading flat across the grass for what looked like 100 miles in every direction. She thought about the farm. She thought about Reuben lying frozen to the ground by the horse trough, his hands still gripping the empty bucket. She thought about Cyrus with his clean fingernails and his lawyer's paper and his 30 days. She thought about her grandmother. And then she set those thoughts down the way her grandmother had taught her to set things down, when they were heavier than the moment could carry. And she went back to digging. The work continued for 3 weeks. Agnes dug a rectangular space approximately 4 meters wide by 6 meters deep. The ceiling she made tall enough to stand upright in the center. She oriented the entrance to catch maximum winter sunlight and maximum protection from the north wind, which everyone in Millhaven agreed cut through a person like a living blade when it came down off the open prairie. The walls she sealed using a technique she had learned at her grandmother's elbow. She mixed clay soil with cut sections of prairie grass, creating a paste. She applied it in layers. When it dried, it formed a surface that was hard and smooth and would not dissolve in moisture. It was a technique older than any country on this continent. It was a technique that the people who had walked this land before any wagon train had crossed it had used for so many generations that the knowledge had become in some way part of the land itself. This was the thing Aldous Holt did not know. This was the thing Eddings did not know. This was the thing that no technical manual published in 1880 contained. Agnes knew it because her grandmother had told her, and her grandmother had known it because her ancestors had lived with it for generations. And that knowledge had passed down through the female line of that family, the way water passes through every kind of ground without losing itself. A boy came on the second week. He came carefully in the late afternoon as though he was not quite sure he was allowed to be there. His name was Clem Briggs. He was 14 years old. His father was the master carpenter of Millhaven Owen Briggs, who at 52 had 30 years of experience and a reputation that no other builder within 70 miles could match. Clem had his father's broad forehead and his father's strong hands, but none of his father's certainty. He had a curious quality that had not yet been trained out of him, an openness to evidence that did not yet match his existing beliefs. He stood at the edge of the dig site and watched Agnes work for a long time before he spoke. "My father says you'll be dead by Christmas," he said. He said it the way a child says a thing he has been told, but has not yet decided whether to believe. Agnes set down her shovel. She looked at him. He was 14. He had walked up here knowing that his father would not approve. He had walked up here anyway. That was a thing worth respecting in a person of any age, but particularly in a person of 14. "Your father is a good carpenter," she said. "Yes, ma'am. The best in 3 counties. But carpentry is a conversation with wood. And this," she gestured at the hill behind her, "is a different conversation." Clem looked at the dig. He looked at the walls she had sealed. He looked at her hands, which were the hands of a woman who had spent 3 weeks doing work that should not have been possible for a person her age. "Can I see inside?" he asked. She stepped aside. He walked down the entrance step. His eyes went wide. "It's warm," he said. "It's already getting cool outside in the evenings. But in here it feels like September afternoon." "The earth holds the summer's warmth," Agnes said. "Same as in winter, it'll hold the cold out. It doesn't fight the weather. It just exists in it." He touched the mud-sealed wall with his fingertips. He pressed gently as though testing something he was trying to understand, through his hands rather than his mind. "My father says this will collapse. Your father builds with wood. Wood fights the weather. Earth just exists in it." Clem stayed 5 minutes longer asking questions. She answered as plainly as she could. When he left, the expression on his face had changed from the reflexive skepticism he had arrived with to something more careful, something more open. He did not know yet what to do with what he had seen, but he was not dismissing it. That evening, Agnes finished her second window. She set the windows as openings the size of a large Bible in the south wall. She covered them with oiled paper stretched over wooden frames. They admitted diffuse light and blocked the wind. She had bought an old iron barrel from the blacksmith for $2. She had paid him 30 cents more to weld its 2 worst holes. This became her stove set in the center of the room with a metal flue pipe she had bought for $1.20 running up through the earth and ceiling. But before she had placed the barrel, she had done something her grandmother had described to her once 55 years before by a fire in Tennessee. She had dug a pit beneath the barrel's intended position. She had filled that pit with large, flat stones hauled from a dry creek bed 3 kilometers away, one at a time, each trip taking the better part of a morning. Those stones would absorb heat from the fire over hours, and then they would release it slowly through the night, maintaining the room's temperature long after the fire itself had gone to coals. The floor she set 15 centimeters lower than the entrance threshold, because cold air, which is heavier than warm, would pool at the floor while breathable heat floated at the level of her body. She covered the floor with flat creek stones. They would absorb the day's heat and release it through the night. The door she built from salvaged shipping crate wood that Constance had sold her for $1. It was not beautiful, but it opened inward, which meant that the pressure of winter wind would seal it more tightly, rather than tearing it from its hinges. When she counted the total cost on the inside cover of her grandmother's Bible by lamplight on the evening of the 20th day, the number was $14.80. She had 20 cents remaining, 3 potatoes, half a bag of flour, a tin of lard, and a hill. The confrontation came the following morning. Aldous Holt rode up the slope with Reverend Calvin Ward beside him. Calvin Ward was Edna's husband. He was in his early 50s. He had a lean build and a voice trained for Sunday mornings and a permanent expression of sorrow for the condition of the world. He carried his Bible, not as an afterthought, as a tool, the way a carpenter carries a level. They stopped their horses at the edge of Agnes's property. They dismounted with the slow ceremony of men who had decided that what they were doing was important enough to require ceremony. Aldous spoke first. "This has gone far enough," he said. "We've come to make arrangements. There's a women's home in Lincoln. They've agreed to receive you. The county will provide transportation. This is the sensible course, and frankly the only one available to a woman of your age in your circumstances." Agnes looked at him without moving. Reverend Ward opened his Bible. "Scripture calls us to care for our elders," he said. "And as your community, we have a responsibility that supersedes your personal preferences in this matter." Agnes said, "Quote me chapter and verse where it says the community may remove an elderly woman from a legal homestead claim because she is poor." Reverend Ward opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. "I know that book," Agnes continued, her voice level and without heat. "My grandmother read it to me every night for 11 years. I know which passages are in it and which ones people quote when they want to do something they have already decided to do." Aldous took a step forward. His voice dropped to the register he reserved for final statements. "If you will not go voluntarily, I have the means to pursue legal intervention through the county on the grounds of incompetence. I am trying to spare you that embarrassment." Agnes met his eyes. The thing that had been hardening in her chest since the road from her old farm was fully formed now, dense and clear as a river stone. "You are welcome to try Mr. Holt," she said, "but I will be here when you come back." The two men stood for a moment in the face of that. They found that the face of it was harder than expected. Aldous Holt had built most of what he owned through the force of his certainty. And there was something unsettling about meeting certainty in a 63-year-old woman with mud on her hands, who did not move when he pushed against her. They left. Agnes watched them go. She waited until they were far enough away that they could not have seen her, even if they had looked back, and then she sat down with her back against the hillside and her hands in her lap. And she did not cry. Not yet. Not yet. She had work to finish. She picked up her shovel, and she went back to it. The home was nearly finished by the second week of September. The cottonwood leaves along the creek had just begun to tremble with yellow at their edges. The air in the mornings carried that particular sharpness that prairie people learned to read as a warning rather than a comfort. Agnes stood before her reclaimed wood door and looked at the grass-covered mound that was her roof, indistinguishable from the hillside, and felt something that was not quite pride, but was older and more durable than pride. It was sufficiency. It was the particular satisfaction of having done an exact thing with her own hands at 63 years old, when the world had told her she was finished. That night she slept for the first time under her own roof on a straw mattress she had sewn from flour sacks. The silence inside the dwelling was different from the silence of the open prairie. It was enclosed silence, the silence of a space that held you rather than exposing you. There was no wind, no wood creaking against its own nature, only the occasional small sound of field mice in their corner, and her own breathing and the slow tick of the iron barrel as it cooled from the evening fire. She slept for 9 hours. She had not slept 9 hours in a single night since the morning Reuben had died. The boy came back on the 3rd day of September. This time he came without a pretext. Clem Briggs stood at the entrance with his hat in his hands and the careful expression of a young person who had been thinking hard about something. Agnes saw him from inside where she was working on her shelves. She set down her tools and went to the door. "Ma'am," Clem said, "I wanted to come back." "I can see that. I've been thinking about what you said, about the conversation with wood being different from the conversation with earth." Agnes stepped aside. He came in. He walked the perimeter of the room slowly, the way a person walks in a church when they are not sure of the rules. He touched the walls. He looked up at the earthen ceiling. He bent and put his hand flat on the stone floor and held it there until he felt the warmth that the stones had held from the morning fire and were now releasing back into the room 4 hours later. "My father couldn't do this," he said. It was not said with disrespect. It was said with the particular precision of a young person discovering for the first time that the adults in their life have limits. "Your father builds magnificent things," Agnes said. "He builds things that stand. There is no shame in not knowing every kind of building. There is only shame in pretending you know what you don't." Clem looked at her. "Will you teach me?" Agnes considered him for a long moment. He was 14. He was the son of a man who had publicly declared she would not survive the winter. He was risking something just by being in her dwelling, and he was asking with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that some questions are supposed to be wrapped in 12 layers of social cushioning before they are delivered. "I'll teach you what I'm willing to teach," she said, "and you'll tell me honestly when you've come and when you've gone. I won't have your father saying I lured his son. I won't carry that weight." "Yes, ma'am. And when you learn something, you'll tell him you learned it, even if he doesn't want to hear. Knowledge that you hide from the people who matter is knowledge that's only half yours." Clem nodded slowly. He stayed 2 hours. Agnes showed him how she had mixed the wall sealant. She showed him the ratios. She showed him the way you tested whether the clay was wet enough by pressing your thumb into it and watching how slowly the impression filled itself back in. She showed him the placement of the stones under the barrel and explained why those particular stones from that particular creek bed held heat better than the rocks he might find on higher ground. He listened the way some people pray. When he left, the sun was setting in the long, slow way of September sunsets, and Agnes stood at the entrance and watched him walk down toward the valley, his small figure getting smaller against the grass until he disappeared into the gathering blue of evening. She did not know yet what would come of it, but she knew that something had begun. Owen Briggs found out the next day, out the next. He found out the way men in small settlements find out about most things, which was that someone had seen Clem coming down the hill and had mentioned it in passing at the smithy, and the smith had mentioned it that evening to Owen when Owen came in to pick up a repaired hinge. Owen did not say anything at the smithy. He paid for the hinge. He walked home. He found Clem at the kitchen table doing arithmetic by lamplight. "Where were you yesterday afternoon?" Clem looked up. The second of hesitation before his answer was 1 second too many. "Up the hill." Owen's voice dropped to the register that fathers use when they are not yet shouting but are making clear that shouting is available. "Her hill. She knows things, Father. Things you don't know. About how to build for winter. I'm not saying that to disrespect you. I'm saying it because it's true, and I thought you'd want to know." The sound Owen made was not a word. He struck his son once across the face. Not hard enough to do damage. Hard enough to mean something. Clem went quiet. His hand came up to his cheek and stayed there. Owen turned and walked to the kitchen window. He stood there with his hands still raised at the level of his chest, not yet lowered, looking out the window in the direction of the north slope where, in the gathering dusk, a thin line of smoke was rising from what looked like an empty hillside. He was a man who had built things his entire life. Good things. Things he was right to be proud of. And it had made him confident. And proud. And over time less open to the possibility that the things he did not know might be more significant than the things he did. He lowered his hand. He did not apologize. He stood at the window for a long time after Clem had gone to his room. The thin line of smoke continued to rise in the distance, steady, unhurried. The old man came on a Tuesday. His name was Abel Prout. He was 72 years old. He had lost 3 fingers off his right hand in the winter of 1866, a winter that had also taken 4 of his neighbors. What had remained in him after that winter was not fear, but a particular quality of humility, the kind of humility that is purchased rather than inherited, and that never lets a man forget what it cost. He was the only person in Millhaven who walked to the north slope that September, to look at what Agnes was building, not to judge it or redirect it, but simply to see it. He stood at the entrance with his hat in his hand. He did not say anything for a long time. He just looked. He looked at the sealed walls. He looked at the stone floor. He looked at the iron barrel with its careful flue pipe. He looked at the small window of oiled paper that admitted the September light in a soft, diffuse glow that did not glare, but did not leave the room dark either. He looked at her hands. Then he said, "Your grandmother teach you this, or did you figure it on your own?" "My grandmother," Agnes said. He nodded once. She was a smart woman. He turned to leave. Then he stopped. He did not turn back around. He spoke with his face still toward the entrance, the way men of his generation spoke about things that mattered when they could not quite face them directly. "You have enough food. For now. For the winter. I'm working on it." He nodded again, still facing away. Then he walked back down the hill without saying goodbye. 2 mornings later, when Agnes opened her door at first light, there was a professional-grade rabbit snare on the ground in front of the entrance. Steel. Well made. The kind that took experience to set correctly. No note. No name. She stood looking at it for a long moment. Then she set it exactly where it would do the most good in the narrow passage between 2 low rocks, where animal tracks had told her rabbits moved at dusk. That evening, the snare held a rabbit. It was the first time since coming to Millhaven that someone had treated Agnes Whitfield as a capable person rather than a problem requiring a solution. The rabbit was the gift. The snare was the real message. Abel Prout, who had walked back to his own cabin and begun stacking his own winter preparations with the thoroughness of a man who did not expect mercy from what was coming, never mentioned it to anyone, not in the store, not in the smithy, not even to his own wife, who had been dead for 14 years, and who, in the long evenings, was sometimes the only person he spoke to anyway. He had said his piece. The snare was the rest of it. October arrived the way it always did in Nebraska, with a performance of beauty that masked the threat behind it. The days were gold. The air smelled of dry grass and sun-warmed earth. It was possible to walk through the afternoons of that month, believing that the world was fundamentally generous. The experienced settlers knew better. In Constance Webb's store, the conversations among the men took on a particular gravity. Abel Prout had said his piece 3 weeks earlier. And though no one had acknowledged it directly, his words had worked their way into the thinking of the people who heard them, the way water works its way into foundation stones slowly, and without announcing itself. Aldous Holt was building a new stable. It was a substantial structure, well-framed, board siding, real windows, a roof designed to shed snow load. It was costing him close to $300, and he was proud of it in the specific way he was proud of all his buildings. The pride of a man who equates the quality of what he can build with the quality of who he is. Owen Briggs was adding a room to his own house. He had designed it himself, as he designed everything with confidence and precision. The brick fireplace he had specified for that room had been sourced from a supplier in Kansas City. It was a beautiful fireplace. What Owen did not yet know was that its flue design created a problem that would reveal itself only under sustained high wind from the north. His wife Rowena had developed a cough in late September that she described as nothing serious. The cough had the character of something positioning itself to become worse under the right conditions. On the north slope, Agnes was gathering. She moved across the prairie in the mornings, slowly conserving the strength of a 63-year-old body that had spent the summer doing the work of a 30-year-old body. She collected dried bison chips from the areas where the old herds had passed years before. She stacked them under a rock overhang that would keep them dry. She gathered edible roots before the ground hardened. She dried the herbs she had been collecting since August. She processed and hung the meat from the rabbits her snare caught with increasing reliability as she learned the correct placements for the terrain. She did not think of this as preparing for hardship. She thought of it as paying attention to what the earth was offering before it changed its offering. Her grandmother had told her once that the people who survived difficult things were rarely the strongest in the moment of crisis. They were the ones who had done the quiet work in the time before crisis, when nobody was watching, when there was no immediate reward for paying attention. Clem Briggs came back. He came with diminishing pretext and increasing frequency, arriving in the late afternoons after his father's work was done. He watched how Agnes moved around the interior, how she managed the fire, how she portioned her supplies, with the careful mathematics of someone who had learned to treat food as a calculation rather than a comfort. "How long will your stores last?" he asked one afternoon. "Until April if I'm careful. March if the winter is hard." Clem looked at the organized shelves, the hanging dried meat, the clay pots of flour and salt, the neat row of dried root vegetables in their sand-filled crate. The arithmetic was telling him something. It was telling him about the difference between what this looked like from the outside and what it actually was, which was a complete system for surviving independently through a Nebraska winter built by an elderly woman with $18 and 3 weeks of work. "My father is finishing the new room," he said after a while. "I've heard the hammering. He's very proud of the fireplace." Agnes said nothing to that, which was its own kind of response. The conspiracy came together that same week. Clem returned 3 days later. He came in the early dusk, and there was no pretext at all this time. His face had the particular quality of someone carrying information they were not sure they should be carrying. He stood at the entrance for a long moment before speaking. "There was a meeting last night," he said. Agnes waited. "At Mr. Holt's house. My father was there. Reverend Ward was there. Some others. Tell me." "They talked about you. Mr. Holt called it a community responsibility. He said if you wouldn't go voluntarily, the county could declare you legally unfit to live alone at your age in your circumstances. He said there's a procedure. It would mean a judge in Lincoln. It would mean the sheriff coming up here with paperwork, and then a wagon to take you to the home." Clem looked at his boots. "My father didn't say much, but he didn't say no either. He didn't stand up for you. I want you to know that. I'm telling you because I want you to know." For a moment, the prairie wind was the only sound between them. "Are you afraid?" Clem asked. Agnes looked at him. He was 14 years old. He had risked something to come here, though he did not yet have the vocabulary for what he had risked. He had risked his father's approval, which at 14 is sometimes the whole world. Yes, she said honestly. But I'm building walls. Clem nodded slowly, the way a person nods when an answer is not what they expected, and turns out to be better for it. He walked home in the dark. Agnes watched him go, and then she went inside, and she sat on her wooden stool by the dying fire, and she put her face in her hands. She did not cry, but she sat very still for a very long time with her face in her hands. The confrontation came 3 days later. It came in the particular form that Agnes had been expecting, without knowing exactly when it would arrive. Aldous Holt and Reverend Calvin Ward came together. They came in the official capacity of men who had decided that what they were doing was for someone else's benefit. Reverend Ward carried his Bible. Aldous Holt carried a document folded in thirds which he did not yet display, but which Agnes could see at the edge of his coat pocket. They stopped at the edge of her property. They dismounted. They walked the last distance on foot with the deliberate slowness of men who had practiced this approach in their minds before performing it in the open. "Mrs. Whitfield," Aldous said, "we've come to make final arrangements. There's a women's home in Lincoln that has agreed to receive you. The county will provide transportation. This is the sensible course." Agnes stood at the entrance of her dwelling with her hands at her sides. She did not invite them inside. Reverend Ward opened his Bible. "Scripture calls us to honor and care for the elderly. We have an obligation that—" "Quote me the chapter and verse," Agnes said, "where it says the community may remove an elderly woman from a legal homestead claim because she has been judged inconvenient." Reverend Ward stopped. He looked down at his Bible as though it might supply the chapter and verse on its own. It did not. "I know that book," Agnes said. "My grandmother read it to me every night of my childhood. I know which passages are in it, and I know which passages people quote when they want to do something they have already decided to do." Aldous took a step forward. He produced the folded document from his pocket. "This is a petition," he said, "signed by myself, Reverend Ward, and 4 other men of standing in this community. It requests that the county judge declare you mentally and physically unfit to maintain an independent homestead at your age on this terrain, and order your transport to a supervised residence. We have not yet filed it. I am telling you about it now in the hope that you will reconsider." He held the document out. Agnes did not take it. She looked at it. She looked at the seal at the top of the page, which was the seal of a lawyer in Lincoln, who had charged Aldous Holt $12 to draft the wording. Then she looked back at Aldous. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I am 63 years old. I have built a dwelling on this hillside with my own hands. In 3 weeks, for $14.80. I have stocked it for winter. I have killed and dressed my own meat. I have laid in fuel. I have sealed every wall against the weather. If a judge in Lincoln looks at what I have done with what I had and concludes that I am unfit to live independently, then it is the judge who is unfit, not me." She paused. "You are welcome to file your petition, but I will be here when you come back." Aldous stood for a long moment. His face went through 3 or 4 expressions, none of which he had planned in advance. He had not expected this. He had expected an old woman to fold under the weight of legal language and the implicit threat of a sheriff with paperwork. He had built most of what he owned through the force of his certainty. And the people who had bent to that certainty over the years had bent because they had recognized somewhere underneath that fighting back was more expensive than yielding. This woman had decided that fighting back was not more expensive. This woman had decided that yielding was the more expensive thing. He had no answer for that. He folded the document. He put it back in his pocket. "You'll regret this," he said. But he said it without conviction. He said it the way a man says something because he has prepared the line in advance and does not know what else to substitute. He turned. He walked back to his horse. Reverend Ward followed him after a moment of hesitation, his Bible still open in his hands. Agnes watched them ride away. She waited until they were small in the distance, until they were a single dark shape against the gold of the autumn grass, until that shape disappeared into the fold of the valley. Then she walked inside. She closed the door. She sat down on her wooden stool. And then, for the first time since leaving the farm, she allowed herself to cry properly. Not one tear, not two, real crying. The kind that uses the shoulders, the kind that comes from a place that has been holding too much for too long, and finally finds a door it can come out through. She cried for Reuben, who had died with his hand on the empty bucket. She cried for the two children, buried beneath the cottonwood in the south field. She cried for the 30 years she had spent building a farm that the law had decided was never hers. She cried for Cyrus, who had given her 30 days as though that was generous. She cried for the fact that at 63 years old, she had been forced to start over with $18 and a flour sack. And she cried for the fact that she had done it. And she cried for the fact that her own success had become a thing the men of this valley wanted to take from her, the way Cyrus had taken the farm, the way the world had taken almost everything else. She cried for 10 minutes, and then she stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She got up. She put another bison chip in the iron barrel, and she went back to work. Frances Holt came on a Tuesday in mid-October. She came alone without her husband's knowledge. She wore a heavy shawl and her nose was red from the cold, and she stood before the earthen door with the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was not completely certain it was the right one. "Forgive me for coming without an invitation," she said. "I wanted to see whether you were well." Agnes stood aside and let her in. Frances descended the entrance step, and her entire body changed. The tension she had been holding against the expected cold dissolved into a steady, enveloping warmth that asked nothing of her. She looked around the interior with the expression of someone who had found a solution to a problem they had been carrying for a long time, with recognition and something close to grief. "My lord," she said quietly, "it's warm." They sat. The silence between them had the quality of silence between two people who were both trying to say something they had not yet found words for. Frances spoke first. What she said was not what Agnes had expected. "I lost a child in the winter of 1871. He was 3 years old. The house we had then was not what we have now. Aldous built a better house the following spring." She stopped. She looked at her hands. "The spring after that, he built an even better one, and then the one we have now. Every winter, he built something bigger and better than the one before. Thomas has never been cold in his life. Neither have the younger boys." She paused again. "But none of those houses ever felt like this." Agnes did not move. "How did you know it would work?" Frances asked. "How did you know at your age that you could do this with your own hands?" "I didn't know," Agnes said. "I trusted what my grandmother told me. And I watched the ground. And I did the work." Frances nodded slowly. Then she said the thing she had come to say, the thing she had been carrying since the night she had watched the amber light from Agnes's dwelling through her bedroom window. "When the storm comes," she said, "and it is coming, I want you to know something. There may be more help available to you than my husband is willing to admit." She did not explain. She stood up. She straightened her shawl. She walked to the entrance. She turned at the threshold. "My husband is not a cruel man," she said. "He is a frightened one. A frightened man with money and influence is a particular kind of dangerous because he does not know he is frightened. He thinks he is right." She paused. "You have done a thing he does not understand. And what a man like that does, with what he does not understand, is he tries to make it stop existing. Be careful." She left. Agnes sat for a long time after she had gone. She thought about Frances Holt's face, the face of a woman who had buried a 3-year-old child in the winter of 1871, and had spent every winter since then watching her husband build larger and larger houses against the cold, as though enough lumber and enough nails and enough good windows could ever close the door on the room in her own chest where that child still lived. Agnes thought about the difference between Aldous Holt's house and her own. His was built against the world. Hers was built with it. That same week, the second meeting happened. Owen Briggs and Aldous Holt met at Aldous' house. The first meeting had produced a plan that had not yet been executed, partly because the legal basis required a county judge 2 days' ride away, and partly because something in Aldous had not quite been able to bring himself to file the petition after his confrontation with Agnes. But there was a different quality to this second meeting. Aldous arrived with his usual authority. Owen arrived with something that was not quite doubt, but occupied the same neighborhood. Halfway through the conversation, Owen asked a question he had not planned to ask. "If she survives the winter," he said, "then what?" Aldous looked at him. "What do you mean, then what?" "I mean, the woman came here with $18. She built a dwelling for $14.80 that appears to be weathering October better than my new room. If she survives the winter, she will have proven something. And I think some of us will have to think about what it is she'll have proven." Aldous was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing that men like him say when they are not yet prepared to examine an uncomfortable possibility. "She won't survive the winter." But there was something in the way he said it that did not match the way he had said it in June. In June, it had been a statement of fact. In October, it was something closer to a prayer. Owen went home early. He claimed Rowena's cough needed attention. He stood outside his new room and listened to Rowena coughing inside it. And he felt something he had not felt since his early years as a carpenter, when every mistake taught him something no textbook contained. He felt the specific discomfort of a capable man beginning to suspect that he might not know as much as he thought. He did not go to the North Slope. He was not ready for that yet. But 2 days later, in the late afternoon, when Rowena was sleeping and Clem was at the smithy and the autumn sun was throwing long shadows across the grass, Owen Briggs saddled his horse and rode north. He stopped at the edge of Agnes's property. He sat on his horse for a long time, looking at the grass-covered mound that was her roof. Then he dismounted. He walked the last distance on foot. Agnes was not there. She had gone to the creek bed 3 kilometers away to gather more flat stones. Her absence was in a way a gift, because what Owen did next was a thing he could not have done with her watching. He stood at the entrance. He looked at the door set into the hillside. He looked at the way the door frame had been fitted, with the inward opening hinge that would seal under wind pressure. He touched the door frame with one finger. Then, with his whole hand, he opened the door. He stepped inside. The warmth that met him was not the warmth of a fire. It was something else, something deeper, something that came from the walls themselves, from the stone floor under his boots, from the very air which had the temperature of a September afternoon at 4 o'clock. Even though outside the autumn wind was already carrying the first hint of the cold that was coming. He stood in the center of the room. He put his hand flat against the sealed earthen wall. He held it there. 30 years of carpentry, 30 years of building things he had been right to be proud of. His hand on that wall was the hand of a man having a conversation with a fact he had refused to acknowledge until the fact refused to be refused any longer. He did not say anything. There was no one there to say anything to. He stood for perhaps 3 minutes, his hand on the wall. Then he took his hand away. He walked back out. He closed the door behind him carefully, the way a man closes the door of a church. He mounted his horse. He rode home. He never told Agnes he had been there. He never told his son. He never told his wife. But that evening, when he sat down to dinner with Rowena and Clem, his face had a quality it had not had before. A quality of a man who had seen something he was going to have to think about for a long time. Clem noticed it. Clem did not say anything either. But that night, lying in his bed listening to his mother's cough, through the thin wall between rooms, Clem made a decision about what kind of man he was going to become. It was a decision a 14-year-old should not have had to make. But many of the best decisions a person makes in their life are decisions they should not have had to make. Constance Webb came on the last Thursday of October. She closed her store early for the first time since her husband's funeral. She walked up the north slope in the late afternoon carrying the leather-bound notebook. She knocked on the reclaimed wood door with the brisk knock of someone conducting business. Inside, she looked around the dwelling for a long minute before speaking. When she finally sat down, she opened the notebook and set it on her knee. "I know what I want," she said. Agnes waited. "Next spring, people will come to Nebraska. Families from Ohio, from Indiana, from Illinois. They'll have homestead claims and no money, and they'll need to know how to build something that will keep them alive through the winter that follows." Constance looked at her. "I sell supplies to those people. I want to sell them knowledge, too. Paired with the supplies, they'll need to apply it." Agnes looked at her for a moment. "You want to sell my knowledge. I want to establish a system in which what you know becomes available to people who need it, and in which both of us benefit from that system." Agnes took the notebook from Constance's hand. She turned to a clean page. She wrote her own conditions in the careful handwriting of a woman who had taught herself to read more deeply from her grandmother's Bible. The conditions were specific. They were fair. They left no ambiguity about credit or compensation. She handed the notebook back. Constance read it. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not exactly a smile, but it was the closest thing to one that Agnes had seen on her face. She signed. It was the first time in all her weeks in Millhaven that Agnes had entered a negotiation and not been the one with less power. She felt the difference in her chest. A small and important shift. Outside, the wind was beginning to change. The November wind. The wind that came down off the open prairie with teeth. The wind that the experienced settlers knew was the herald of something larger. Something that the calendar had not yet caught up to, but the earth itself was already preparing for. The beavers on the eastern creek were building higher than anyone in Millhaven had ever seen. Abel Prout had noticed. He was at home alone, adding logs to his fire with the slow, careful rhythm of an old man who had survived 1866 and had been paying attention to the natural world ever since, with the focused interest of a person who understood that it was trying to tell him something important. Down in the valley, Aldous Holt was inspecting the new stable that had cost him close to $300. In the Briggs house, Owen was still thinking about the wall. In the Ward house, the chimney was already making the small reversal sounds that would in 5 weeks become a crisis. And on the north slope, in a small earthen room that smelled of warm clay and dried herbs, and the slow, steady heat of stones that had spent the day absorbing sunlight, Agnes Whitfield sat at her wooden table and ate a bowl of rabbit stew and listened to the wind beginning to move across the grass outside, and thought about her grandmother. The earth doesn't fight the weather. It absorbs it. She finished her stew. She washed the bowl. She added one more chip to the fire, and she went to sleep warm in the house she had built with her own hands at 63 years old, while above her the prairie wind rose and the temperature began to fall, and somewhere far to the northwest, in a place no man in Millhaven could see, the first edges of the storm that would come, on the 22nd of December, were already beginning to gather. By the second week of November, the character of the sky had changed. The angle of light was different, lower, thinner, as if the sun was conserving itself for some purpose it had not yet announced. The creek at the bottom of the valley carried a skim of ice at its edges each morning, and the grass on the prairie had gone the color of old straw, and the wind no longer rose and fell with the breath of the day. The wind was simply present now, a constant living thing that pressed against every structure in Millhaven, every hour, every minute. Agnes had finished her preparations. Her fuel supply would carry her through April, even in a severe winter, because her dwelling required only a fraction of what a wooden house needed. She had food for 4 months. She had dried herbs for medicine. She had her snare, which she had learned to set with the reliability of a person who had paid attention long enough for a skill to become instinct. The cough in Rowena Briggs's chest had deepened. The new room in the Briggs house had begun to make a particular sound when the north wind hit it, a low, dry creaking that meant nothing to a man who had not heard it before, and a great deal to a man who had. Owen Briggs had begun quietly to spend more time in that room. He stood in it sometimes for 10 minutes at a stretch with his hand flat against the wall, listening, trying to understand what he was hearing, trying to figure out in the language of his 30 years of carpentry what the room was telling him. The room was telling him something he did not want to hear. He did not say it out loud. But he had begun in the last week of November to do something he had not done in 20 years. He had begun to look at his own work the way a younger man looks at the work of someone he has not yet decided to trust. The storm was already beginning to gather, far to the northwest in country that no man in Millhaven could see. The air had begun to do the thing that the experienced settlers knew about, but rarely discussed in the open. It had begun to drop, not slowly, not in the polite gradient of a season turning. It had begun to drop the way a man drops a stone over the side of a well, with no intention of catching it before it hit bottom. Abel Prout knew. He stood outside his cabin in the early evening of December 19th and looked at the sky and the way the few remaining birds were holding their wings against their bodies. He went inside and added a log to his fire. He took down his oldest blankets from the trunk where they lived in summer. He laid them out across the bed where he slept. He did not panic. A man who had survived 1866 did not panic about weather. He simply prepared. On the evening of December 22nd, Agnes came outside to bring in her last load of fuel before dark. She set down the basket. She stood upright, and the sound that reached her was the sound of no sound at all. The wind had stopped, not diminished, stopped. For weeks, the wind had been a constant living presence. Its absence was not peaceful. It was the absence of something that had always been there, the specific silence that sits before very large sounds, the held breath before the thing that cannot be stopped. She looked at the sky. It had turned the color of old bone in the northwest, a yellowish tone that had nothing to do with sunset, and everything to do with what was behind the sunset. The birds that had remained through December were gone, not moved to a different field. Gone. She went inside. She added fuel, more than her usual evening amount. She checked every wall joint by touch in the half-dark, the way she had been checking them every night, her fingers reading the seams, the way her grandmother's fingers had once read the pages of her Bible. She checked the flue seal. She checked the door. She moved through the dwelling systematically, methodically, the way a captain checks a ship before bad weather, knowing that anything missed now cannot be corrected later. The room was warm. The stones were charged. The stores were full. She sat on her wooden stool. She put her hand on her own knee, the old knee that had been giving her trouble since October. And she thought about her grandmother, and about Reuben, and about the 2 children buried beneath the cottonwood in the south field of a farm that no longer belonged to her. And then she thought about the morning that was coming. Down in the valley, Aldous Holt went through his house one last time before bed. He checked his 3 fires. They were all burning well. He had good firewood stacked along the side of the house in a quantity he had considered generous when he had ordered it in September. He looked at the stack now in the last light of December 22nd. For the first time, he felt the edge of something he did not have a name for yet. Something that was not quite worry. But that occupied the same quiet space where worry lives before it announces itself. He went to bed. Above the valley, the sky continued its color change. Slow. Certain. The way all large things move. And what was behind that yellowish sky was already on its way. It did not arrive like weather. It arrived like a verdict. The morning of December 23rd began with a stillness so complete that Millhaven felt suspended in something other than air. The cattle in the valley stood motionless at the edges of their enclosures, as though they had been placed there by someone arranging a scene. The sky in the northwest had gone from the yellowish bone color of the previous evening to a flat, uniform gray that had no depth to it, no variation, no suggestion that anything existed behind it except more of itself. Agnes was already awake when it started. She had not slept past 4 o'clock. Something in the quality of the silence had pulled her up from sleep the same way a sudden sound would have. Because sometimes the absence of a thing that should be present is louder than any noise. She had her fuel loaded and her water stored and her door sealed before the first needle of ice came in sideways off the open prairie. That was what it was initially, not snowflakes. Ice needles driven horizontal by a wind that had apparently been saving itself for exactly this moment. A wind that arrived not as a gust, but as a sustained force, like a hand pressed flat against every exposed surface in the county and simply held there. By noon, the temperature had dropped 25 degrees. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it was impossible to see 3 meters in any direction. The world outside the entrance of Agnes's dwelling had become a single, undifferentiated roar of white and cold, and the entrance itself reduced that roar to a distant sound, present but not threatening, the way thunder sounds when it is several counties away. Inside, the stones were warm. The barrel ticked quietly. The temperature held. Agnes sat on her wooden stool, and she did the only thing she could think to do, which was the thing her grandmother had taught her to do in difficult hours. She mended a sock by lamplight, slowly, carefully, the work of her hands moving in the small, deliberate rhythms of a task that did not need to be done quickly. She listened to the storm try to find a way in, and she felt it fail. In the valley below the Hollis house, no. In the valley below the Holt house was experiencing what large, well-built wooden houses experience during sustained assaults of extreme cold, which is that they reveal themselves to be collections of small gaps. Every joint between boards, every space around a window frame, every imperfect seal around a door. Each of these became a channel for cold air, and those channels multiplied across the surface of a two-story house until the interior began to feel less like a protected space and more like a slightly warmer version of the outside. Aldous had his 3 fires running at full capacity by mid-afternoon. His oldest son, Thomas, and his 2 younger boys were taking turns maintaining them, rotating through the house every 2 hours to keep the wood supply moving. By evening, Aldous did the calculation he had been avoiding. He counted what remained against what the night would require, and he arrived at a number that made his jaw tighten in a way his sons had not seen before. He did not say anything to his family that night about the calculation. He added a log he had not planned to add. He sent everyone to bed. In the Briggs house, Rowena's cough had worsened through the afternoon as the temperature dropped, and the drafts found her wherever she positioned herself. Owen moved her from room to room, chasing warmth that was always slightly ahead of where they were. The new room. The room with the Kansas City fireplace. The room he had been so proud of. Owen had sealed it off entirely by evening, because its flue design created a reverse draft under sustained north wind that filled the room with smoke faster than the fireplace could warm it. Clem Briggs sat in the main room of the house and listened to his mother cough, and he listened to his father move through the house, with the specific sound of a capable man encountering the limits of his capability. Clem was 14 years old. He understood with the clarity that sometimes comes to young people precisely because they have not yet learned to protect themselves from understanding that there was a place not far from where they were sitting that was warm and safe, and that his mother needed it. He did not say this to his father. Not yet. In the Ward house, the smoke problem had become critical within 6 hours of the storm's arrival. Every attempt to sustain a fire resulted in smoke filling the house. Reverend Calvin Ward had tried sealing the chimney throat entirely, which solved the smoke and introduced a cold so penetrating that his youngest daughter, 9 years old, began crying with the specific flat crying of a child whose pain has moved past the sharp stage. Her feet, the toes of her right foot, had gone white, then mottled purple. Before her mother, Edna wrapped them in every available cloth and held them against her own stomach for warmth. The first night passed. On the morning of December 24th, the storm did not moderate. It intensified. Aldous Holt stood at his bedroom window and scraped a circle in the frost with his thumbnail, enough to see out. The visibility was perhaps 5 meters. He could not see the stable he knew was 40 meters away. He scraped the frost circle wider, angling to look toward the north slope. For a long time he saw nothing but white. Then he saw it. A thread of smoke, thin as a pencil line, rising straight up from the hillside. Straight up, which meant it was not being torn apart by the wind. Which meant it was coming from somewhere protected enough that even in this storm the draft was clean and steady. It rose, and then the wind took it sideways 50 meters up, but at the source it was steady, and it was there, and it had been there all night, and it would be there when his firewood ran out sometime tomorrow. He called to his oldest son. Thomas came to the window. He looked where his father pointed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The smoke thread was impossibly calm against the violence of everything around it. "I was wrong," Aldous said. He said it the way a man says something he has been building toward for months without knowing he was building toward it. It came out with the particular flatness of a thing that has been compressed for too long. About her, about what she built. I looked at it, and I saw what I expected to see, instead of what was there. He paused, and I need you to know that. Thomas was 22 years old. He had grown up watching his father be certain about everything which had appeared from the outside to be the same thing as being right. This was the first time he had heard the other sentence. He did not know what to do with it yet. but he stored it with the careful attention of someone who understands that certain things heard once changed the way you see everything that came before them. "What do we do?" Thomas asked. Aldous turned from the window. "We wait for a break in the storm, any break at all, and then we go up that hill." The break came in the early morning of December 25th, a 2-hour lull between the first phase of the blizzard and what the older settlers would later recognize as its more sustained second phase. The wind dropped from a sustained howl to a moan. The visibility opened to perhaps 30 meters, which was enough. Owen Briggs had been awake since 3 o'clock in the morning. Rowena's cough had moved into her chest in the way that chest coughs move, settling deep. She had a fever now, low but present, and Owen understood that warmth was no longer a comfort for her. It was a medical requirement. He wrapped her in every blanket they owned. He lifted her. He walked out into the lull. He did not wake his sons. He went alone, and the reason he went alone was the same reason a man sometimes drives to a difficult destination by himself. Because there are certain admissions that are easier to make without witnesses. And what Owen Briggs was about to do was the largest admission of his professional life. He carried his wife up the north slope through snow that came to his knees. He stopped twice, not because he was tired, because his arms had begun to shake in the particular way arms shake when they are carrying something more than weight. He reached Agnes's entrance. He stopped. He knocked. Agnes opened the door. She found on her threshold a man she had last seen walking away from her dwelling with the absolute confidence of someone who had never needed to return. He was standing in the diminished storm with his wife in his arms. His face had the expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not expected to arrive. He did not preamble it. "I have nowhere else to bring her." Agnes looked at Rowena. She checked her breathing, the color at her lips, the way she held her own weight even wrapped in her husband's arms. Then Agnes stepped back. She held the door open. "Put her close to the barrel," she said. "East side." Owen carried his wife inside. He set her down with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something he was afraid of losing. He straightened up. He stood in the center of the room. And then he did something that told Agnes more about him than anything she had observed in the months since her arrival in Millhaven. He put his hand flat against the sealed earthen wall. He stood there for a long moment, not looking at it, just feeling it. 30 years of carpentry. 30 years of building things in the only way he had known to build. His hand on that wall was the hand of a man having a conversation with a fact he had refused to acknowledge until the fact had refused to be refused any longer. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Agnes put water onto heat. They arrived in 3 separate groups over the following 2 hours, drawn by the same calculation that Owen had made, the arithmetic of survival overriding everything else. The Holt family came together. Aldous first, then Francis, then Thomas, and the 2 younger boys. Aldous stopped in front of Agnes, with the long field between them, the field of every word he had said since June. He stood in it for a moment before he crossed it. "My boys are cold," he said. "We have no more wood." Francis was behind him. When Agnes looked at her, Francis gave the smallest possible nod, the nod of a woman who had been waiting for this moment since October, and had kept its possibility alive through the intervening weeks, without telling anyone she was doing it. Agnes stood aside. "Come in." The Ward family arrived 10 minutes after the Holts. Reverend Calvin Ward carried his daughter. Her feet were wrapped in cloth. Her face had the flushed, papery look of a child who had been cold long enough for it to change her. Edna walked behind him. The thing that struck Agnes most about Edna Ward's entrance was the silence of it. There was no announcement, no framework of scripture or social obligation placed around the act. Edna walked down the entrance step and sat down on the floor next to the barrel, without speaking, and held her daughter's wrapped feet between her own hands. Constance Webb came last, alone, an hour after the Wards, pushing through the second phase of the blizzard that had resumed while the others were settling in. She arrived with a bag of hard bread which she set down without ceremony, and with something else. The leather notebook. She sat in front of Agnes. She opened the notebook to the first page where Agnes's signature was. She turned the pages slowly, each one listing purchases, dates, amounts. The complete record of what Agnes had bought on credit over the past 6 months. Then Constance began tearing the pages out one at a time and dropping them into the barrel where the fire was burning low. Each page took about 4 seconds to become heat. "Debt is cleared," Constance said. "That wasn't the arrangement," Agnes said. Constance looked up at her, with the direct, assessing gaze that had characterized every interaction they had ever had. No, it wasn't. The arrangement was business. She looked around the room. 14 people. In a space built for one. 14 people who were alive because of something this woman had known and done and built with her own hands. At 63 years old, with $18, when every person in this room had told her she was wrong. This is something else. There was a pause between them. Then Agnes nodded. The room held 14 people. It was crowded in the way a lifeboat is crowded, which is to say that no one in it had any interest in complaining about the crowding. Agnes managed the space with the systematic calm of someone who had been in some essential way preparing for exactly this, even if she had not known she was preparing for it. The children near the barrel. Rowena Briggs in the warmest position available. The men around the perimeter. The women in the middle. She prepared tea from her dried herb stores and passed it in her single cup, refilled repeatedly. She warmed flat creek stones in the barrel, wrapped them in cloth, distributed them to the people whose temperature she was most concerned about, beginning with Rowena and the Ward girl, working outward. She did not say, "I told you." She did not say, "You should have listened." She did not arrange her generosity in a way that required acknowledgement of her rightness. She simply did what needed doing, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned from her grandmother, with the weathered hands and the slow voice that the earth takes everyone in without asking whether they deserve it. On the second evening, with the blizzard in its deepest phase, and the temperature outside reaching 42 below, Aldous Holt and Reverend Ward had an argument. It was not a large argument. It was the kind of argument that happens between two men who are both accustomed to being the authority in every room they occupy, and have suddenly found themselves in a room where neither of them is the authority at all. It was about something specific and unimportant. The question of where one of the Holt boys was sitting relative to one of the Reverend's children. But the specific content was just the surface of it. Underneath was the pressure of 2 days of cold and fear, and the very new, very uncomfortable experience of being wrong about something that had mattered. Clem Briggs was sitting 4 feet from where the argument was happening. He was 14 years old. He watched the two men, the way young people watch adults behaving badly, with a clarity the adults have lost access to. His expression did not change. He simply watched. Aldous saw the boy watching him. He stopped in the middle of a sentence. He looked at Clem. And what he saw in Clem's face was not judgment, not contempt. It was something more patient and more damaging than either of those things. It was the look of a young person who had already decided what kind of man he did not want to become. and was in the process of having that decision confirmed. Aldous sat down. "I apologize, Reverend," he said into the silence that followed. "That wasn't necessary." Reverend Ward looked at him for a moment, then at the floor. "No," he said, "it wasn't." Agnes, who had not looked up from what she was doing, quietly asked Thomas Holt to help her move the fuel supply from the exterior alcove to the interior shelf. Thomas went immediately. The moment passed. Later, when most of the room was sleeping, Clem came and sat near Agnes. The fire was low. The stones were doing their work. The temperature in the room was holding stable, as it had been for 2 days. "Why did you let us in?" he asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Agnes considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because turning someone away from warmth when you have warmth is a choice I would have to live with, she said. And because my grandmother taught me something that took me a long time to understand. She said the earth doesn't ask whether you deserve to come in. It just holds the door open. She looked at the ceiling. I learned from the earth. Clem was quiet for a moment. My father touched the wall today. For a long time. I know. I don't think he knew he was doing it. Sometimes that's how people learn the most important things. When they stop meaning to. Clem looked at the earthen ceiling, dark above them, holding the weight of a foot of snow, and the temperature of the season, and everything the storm could deliver, holding it all without complaint, without drama, without any interest in being acknowledged for holding it. He reached out. He pressed his own palm flat against the wall beside him. He held it there. On the morning of the third day, the blizzard exhaled its last breath and stopped. The silence it left behind was total, the specific silence of a world that had been remade overnight. Everyone in the dwelling heard it at the same moment, the cessation of the sustained roar that had been the background of every moment for 60 hours. People who had been sleeping woke up. People who had been awake sat up straighter. Agnes opened the door. The world outside was white from one horizon to the other, the kind of white that has its own light, reflecting the early sun in a way that made the eyes ache. The snow was to her knees in the open space before the entrance, deeper in drifts against the hill behind her. The sky was a blue so saturated it looked painted, the specific blue that appears after extreme storms, as though the sky is trying to compensate for what it just did. The temperature outside was still 20 below zero, but the wind was gone. And without wind, 20 below is survivable in a way that 42 below in a gale is not. And everyone who came out of that dwelling into that brilliant, cold morning understood the difference in their bodies before they understood it in their minds. They stood in a loose group looking down at the valley, the Holt stable, the large new one that had cost close to $300, had lost its roof. Dark shapes in the white snow around it told a story Aldous did not walk toward. He stood on the hillside and looked at it from a distance and did not speak. The Briggs house stood, but the new room's roof had a visible sag at its eastern corner. One window on the north face had been pushed inward by ice expansion, leaving a black rectangular opening that had been admitting outside air for an unknown number of hours. The Ward house had lost a section of its front porch and a piece of the main roof over the parlor. The chimney that had caused such difficulty had a visible crack in its exterior stonework. Agnes turned and looked at the dwelling behind her. The snow had drifted up against the south face of the hill and covered the entrance overhang entirely, so that the only indication anything was there was the entrance step, just visible, and the thin flue pipe rising from what appeared to be a natural hillside. The grass on the roof had been compressed by the snow into something denser and more uniform. There was no structural damage, There was no evidence of stress. The Earth had absorbed 60 hours of assault at 42 below zero and had simply continued being the Earth. They left in stages. By family. As the morning warmed toward the merely very cold, Owen Briggs went last among the men, having made sure Rowena was stable enough to walk with assistance. He stopped in front of Agnes before leaving. The thing he said was not a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. "I built things my entire life," he said. "Good things. Things I was right to be proud of." He paused. "And I built this winter wrong. The new room. The fireplace. I built it the way I've always built. And the way I've always built was not wrong exactly. But it was not complete." He looked at the hillside. "I'd like to understand what I was missing. When you're ready to talk about it, I'll listen." It was the most professionally significant sentence Owen Briggs had uttered in 30 years, and both of them knew it. "Come in the spring," Agnes said. "Bring your notebook." He nodded. He went. Aldous Holt was already down the hill with his sons when he stopped. He turned back. Francis had been waiting for this, with the patient certainty of someone who knew a person well enough to know what they would eventually do. He walked back up to where Agnes was standing. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then took it. The handshake lasted longer than handshakes usually last, which is what happens when a handshake is doing the work that words have not been found for yet. "I said you wouldn't survive October," Aldous said. "Then I said you wouldn't survive the winter." He stopped. His voice had the quality of a man working with an unfamiliar tool. "I was wrong, both times. About the dwelling. About you." He paused once more. "About what a person is capable of, when the people around them are too certain to look properly." He went down the hill. Thomas, waiting at the bottom, fell into step beside his father. Aldous put his hand on his son's shoulder as they walked, and the gesture had the weight of everything that had been said at the frost-scraped window. 2 days before, Edna Ward was the last to leave. Her daughter was walking now. Carefully, the color back in her face. Edna stood before Agnes in the bright winter morning. She was quiet for a moment that stretched past the length of comfortable silence into something more honest. "I came to your property twice," Edna said, "and both times I told you what you should do with your life. I told you it as though I had the authority to know." She stopped. "I didn't have that authority. I assigned it to myself. And I used it to make things harder for you than they needed to be." She looked at Agnes directly. "I'm sorry." Agnes let the silence after that apology be what it was. She did not rush past it. She looked at Edna Ward, at the woman underneath the black dress, and the assigned authority in the gray eyes that judged. In what she found, there was a person who had been genuinely frightened of something she did not know how to name, and who had turned that fear outward in the direction of a 63-year-old widow who she had decided could not fight back. "It's done," Agnes said. "Not forgiven exactly, in the formal sense. Something more complete than forgiveness. Finished. Set down. Over." Edna nodded once. She took her daughter's hand. She walked down the hill. Constance Webb had already gone, characteristically, without ceremony or conclusion, slipping away while people were occupied with their own departures. She had left the bag of hard bread. She had not waited to be thanked. Agnes stood alone before her dwelling in the winter bright morning. She looked at what the storm had done, and not done, and at the valley where the community of Millhaven was returning to itself after the worst night in its collective memory. and she felt the particular quality of tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from having been fully present in something large and demanding. She put her hand on her own chest. She breathed. The air was cold and clean. Spring came in the way Nebraska springs come, which is to say, not gently. It came in fits. Warm days followed by late frosts. Mud that froze overnight and thawed again by afternoon. The ground cycling through states until it finally committed to warming, and stayed there. Owen Briggs came in March as he had said he would, with a leather-bound notebook, and the posture of a man who had settled something with himself in the intervening weeks. He sat on Agnes's floor. He wrote down what she told him, the practical specifics, the ratios for the wall mixture, the minimum depth requirements, the roof loading calculations, the stone placement under the barrel. He asked good questions. His questions were the questions of an expert in a related field encountering a different tradition of expertise. The conversation between them had the specific quality of productive argument, two capable people working toward the same understanding from different directions. 30 years, he said at one point, not bitterly, but with the evenness of a man who had completed an accounting. I built houses that kept the weather out, mostly. You built a house that let the earth in. I was solving the wrong problem. He came back twice more that spring. By April, he had built a modified version of Agnes's principles into the repair work on his damaged room. And the improvement in his house's temperature stability over the following months was a fact that he mentioned to every settler who asked him about his work, without exception. And when he mentioned it, he always said where the knowledge had come from. Aldous Holt sent a cow. He arrived with it himself, leading it up the hill on a rope. The transaction was completed with minimal conversation, which was the appropriate amount. The cow had a calf that spring, and the milk changed Agnes's daily calculation from sufficient to comfortable. Clem Briggs came more often that spring. He was genuinely useful, in the ways his age and the season permitted, carrying heavy things, digging the early garden beds Agnes had planned for the grass above the dwelling, learning without being explicitly taught. He had the quality of a young person who had decided on a direction and was moving in it, with the specific momentum of someone who had figured out early what kind of knowledge mattered. By summer, the roof garden was producing. The depth of soil above the dwelling combined with the stable temperature below it created growing conditions that surprised even Agnes, and she had expected the garden to do well. The roots went deeper than surface gardens. The yields were consistent. People noticed. Constance Webb began selling the concept alongside the building supplies, exactly as she had proposed. And she began every such conversation exactly as she had agreed. The knowledge belongs to Agnes Whitfield, she would say. What I'm selling you is the material to apply it. On a morning in June, early before the heat of the day had arrived, Agnes sat in the entrance of her dwelling. The valley below was green and ordinary, in the way places are ordinary when they have returned to themselves after doing something extreme. The houses stood where they always had. Smoke rose from morning fires. A dog crossed the road at the bottom of the valley. Somewhere a hammer struck the ground in the particular rhythm of deliberate construction. On the hill, directly adjacent to hers, Clem Briggs was digging. He had started the previous week, after asking her 2 specific technical questions, and then going away to think about her answers, before returning with his shovel. He was building for a family that had arrived in May from Indiana, people who had a homestead claim and no money, and a winter ahead of them that would be their first. They had paid Clem in labor, which he had decided was sufficient. He worked with a focused quiet that Agnes recognized. Because it was the same quality of attention she had brought to that hillside 11 months before. The attention of someone who had found the specific thing they knew how to do, and was doing it in the full understanding of why it mattered. She watched him work. Her grandmother had put her hand on the ground outside their Tennessee farmhouse one evening when Agnes was 9 years old, and had said something that Agnes had not fully understood then. She understood it now, sitting in the entrance of the home she had built, with $2.50, and 3 weeks of work, and the knowledge that had been passed to her through the female line of her family, like a river passing through every kind of ground, without losing itself. The earth doesn't ask you to earn your place in it, Agnes. It already made room for you before you arrived. All you have to do is accept the room. Agnes had accepted the room. She had been told she would not survive October. She had survived October, and November, and December, and the worst blizzard in the recorded history of the Nebraska Territory. And she was sitting now in June sunlight, 64 years old, with a boy on the next hill carrying her knowledge forward into the next winter, and the winter after that, and the knowledge itself was older than any country on this continent, older than the names people had given to the land, older than the arguments about who owned it, old as the earth. That had held its warmth through every winter that had ever come, steadily, without drama, without requiring acknowledgement. It had held her. The hammer struck on the hillside beside her, rhythmic and sure, and the smoke from her morning fire rose straight up into the blue Nebraska sky, thin and steady and calm, exactly as it had risen through every cold night of that long winter, exactly as it would rise through every winter to come.